You know the worst feeling at a training camp? That moment on the first big climb where your legs are absolutely screaming, you just watch the group ride away and you're thinking, bloody hell, I've got 6 more days of this. I've got a rider heading to a spring camp, and my job is to make sure that doesn't happen to her. But I think here's what's interesting. For professional cyclists, a training camp is where fitness is built. They've got the time, the recovery infrastructure, the support staff. The camp is just an extension of their normal training life with better weather and more support. For an amateur with a full-time job, the equation is completely different. Training hours are limited, maybe 8 to 12 hours a week if you're dedicated. Recovery is often compromised by work stress, family demands, disrupted sleep, bad housemates. You don't have a massage therapist. You don't have a personal chef. So the camp becomes something else entirely. It's not just where you build fitness for the year. You need to arrive with it already in place. And that raises a question. How do you structure a 12-week build for someone who just can't add volume indefinitely? Now, the traditional approach would be mixed or concurrent periodization, a bit of everything each week, some VO2 work, some sprint work, some threshold, some endurance, gradually ramping up over time. And that works. Plenty of athletes have got very fit that way, myself included, but I feel there's an alternative approach that is often missed out on, sometimes called block periodization or concentrated loading. The idea here is simple. Instead of mixing everything together, you focus on one quality at a time. Why might that work better? So different types of training create different adaptive signals. VO2 max works tells the body one thing, threshold work tells it something else. When you're doing both in the same week, maybe separated by a couple of days, there is some evidence that those signals interfere with each other. So you end up getting a moderate adaptation to both rather than a strong adaptation to either. With concentrated blocks, you're giving the body a message, adapt to this. 2 weeks of hammering VO2 max, then recover. Then 2 weeks of threshold, clear signal, clear recovery, and move on. The research on this is supportive, but I'll be honest, not entirely overwhelming. Ronstadt's studies from 2012 and 2014 showed that concentrated high-intensity blocks produce greater improvements in VO2 max and power output than the same work spread across more weeks. A meta-analysis by Molman in 2019 found small but significant advantages for this approach. So the research on this is supportive, but I'll be honest, not overwhelming. There were studies in 2012 and 2014 that showed concentrated high-intensity blocks produce greater improvements in VO2 max and power output than the same work spread across more weeks. A further meta-analysis in 2019 found small but significant advantages for this approach as well. I want to be honest, most of these studies are small and the effect sizes are often modest. It's not a magic bullet, but the direction is consistent and it aligns with how we think adaptation works. Now, for an amateur with limited time, that's enough for me to use it. Within this approach, there's still a question of block length. I'm using 2 weeks off, 1 week off, and here is why. First, recovery frequency. With 2-week blocks, she's never more than 14 days away from a deload, and that matters for someone with a demanding job. Life stress accumulates alongside training stress. By week 3 or 4 of a longer block, we've been there. The wheels can start falling off. With shorter blocks, the recovery is always visible. That makes it psychologically easier to actually push hard during the work weeks. Second, fatigue management. When you train, you're accumulating both fitness and fatigue. Fatigue builds quickly, but also clears quickly when you rest. Fitness builds slower, but does persist for longer. More frequent recovery gives fatigue more opportunities to clear, so you're less likely to dig yourself into a hole. Third, cognitive simplicity. When this week is VO2 max and next week is VO2 max, there's less mental overhead. You show up, you do the work, you recover, then we shift focus. For someone balancing training with a career, that simplicity matters. So the overall shape for this plan is going to be aerobic volume block to start, then 2 weeks of VO2 max, 2 weeks of threshold, and then 2 weeks of heat training. I'm going to come back to that later, with deload weeks between each. The order isn't arbitrary. Each phase creates conditions that make the next phase more effective. VO2 max is the ceiling of the aerobic system, the maximum rate you can take in, transport and use oxygen. Threshold power is simply a percentage of that ceiling. If we raise the ceiling, threshold can sit the same percentage but represent higher absolute power. I think of it like a building. If threshold is on the 5th floor of a 10-story building, that's one thing. Add 5 more stories and the 5th floor is now higher off the ground. That's why we do VO2 max work first, raise the ceiling, create that headroom for everything else that follows. Now the ceiling is higher. This phase targets the ability to sustain a high percentage of that new ceiling. We're improving lactate clearance, metabolic efficiency, and that percentage of VO2 max that this rider can hold. If we'd done threshold first, we would have been building sustainable power relative to the old lower ceiling. By sequencing it this way, the threshold work is targeting higher absolute power because we've already lifted that ceiling up. The last block of this will be heat training. This is the part most coaches won't program, but the rationale is compelling. When you train in heat or simulated heat with extra layers on and no fan, the body adapts to thermal stress. The most significant adaptation here is plasma volume expansion. You're essentially making more blood. More blood means better stroke volume, better oxygen delivery, and better thermoregulation. There's even evidence that heat acclimation can stimulate EPO and increase hemoglobin mass, similar to altitude training. Lorenzo's 2010 study is the one that I keep coming back to. So 10 days of heat acclimation produced 6.5% plasma volume expansion, and that resulted in a 5 to 8% improvement in VO2 max and time trial performance. And here's the key finding from that. Those improvements were measured in cool conditions, 13 degrees C, not in the heat. The adaptations transfer. You're not just becoming better at coping with heat, you're becoming a more efficient aerobic athlete across the board. It is total legal performance enhancement, accessible to anyone with a turbo trainer and some extra layers, and it doesn't require needles like they used in the 90s. The catch of this is though that heat adaptations decay quickly. About 75% is lost within 3 weeks if you stop entirely. So we finish the heat block about a week before the camp, tight enough to retain the benefit, but also giving enough time for a taper. One more element woven through the whole plan is strength training. There's an old belief that strength training interferes with aerobic adaptation. At extremes, maybe, but for moderate strength work, the evidence suggests it's entirely beneficial, not harmful. Stronger muscles fatigue slower at submaximal intensities. Stronger connective tissue means a reduced injury risk. And for a camp with climbing, that muscular durability matters. Low cadence, grinding on steep gradients, it's a muscular demand, not just aerobic. If your legs give out on a climb on day 5, your aerobic fitness won't save you. The thing about strength training, we're not building mass, just maintaining what we built in the off season and keeping the neuromuscular system engaged. 2 sessions per week, moderate to high load, low reps, pure strength gains. So a plan is just a hypothesis. The real coaching for me is going to be in the monitoring. RPE versus power, same wattage, how does it feel? If threshold intervals start feeling like a 7 instead of an 8, that's adaptation. If the same power feels harder, especially late in the block, that's a warning sign. Heart rate recovery, not the rise during the efforts, that's just physiology, but how quickly does heart rate drop between intervals? If recovery is getting slower across a session or across a week, the autonomic system is stressed. Communication, how is she actually feeling? Sleep, motivation, external stressors. Training doesn't happen in a vacuum. A hard week at work impacts the ability to absorb a hard week of training. And this rider, she is excellent at telling me this. When something feels off, she sends me a message. And that trust is what allows me to program aggressively. After each recovery week, I expect to see a bounce. Fresher legs, easier power, motivation. If she comes out of that deload still feeling flat, something went wrong. Either the block was too aggressive or we didn't rest enough. I want to tie this back to where we started. She's not a professional. She doesn't have 20, 25 hours a week. She doesn't have a support team around her. She's fitting this around a demanding job and a full life. And that shapes everything. So for me, these concentrated blocks make total sense. because you're getting a strong adaptive signal in a time-efficient package. 2 weeks of focused VO2 max work, not 6 weeks of diluted mixed training. Frequent deloads make sense because life stress accumulates alongside training stress. There's always a pressure release valve coming. The simple structure makes sense because decision fatigue is real. And the goal itself is different. She's not peaking for a race. She's preparing to enjoy a week in Spain with her club and her mates and not have that fear hanging over her that she's going to be the one that's slowing everyone down. She's going to be present for the coffee stops and the views from the top of the mountains, rather than absolutely burying herself in survival mode. If you're interested, I can give you the week-by-week details, or I'll stick them in the description, but the principles matter more than specifics here. Concentrated stimulus, frequent recovery, and strength as durability, and monitoring to know when to adjust. I'll follow this up after the camp and let you know what worked, what I'd change. And that's coaching. You make the best decisions you can with the evidence available, then you learn from what actually happens. If you've got an event coming up and you're thinking about how to structure your build, drop some questions in the comments. And if you've got a trip planned to Spain, make sure you wear sunscreen, don't get burnt. Saddle up and enjoy the ride. Thank you.